Oftentimes when songs can fall flat are in the verses, because often we put enough love into the choruses that the choruses do tend to shine. And it's really well known that second verses especially can be a huge curse. But in this video, we're going to talk about 5 different ways that we can make sure to keep our verses more interesting in general. Let's talk about it. So one way to keep our verses more interesting is by changing the stylistics between verses. So for example, if your first verse is very piano heavy and it's basically mostly just the piano, maybe in the second verse, if you instead go more of a guitar route, maybe you have layers of electric guitars that are playing similar but not exactly the same riff as what the piano played in the first verse, or you play totally different riffs with the underlying chords still being the same. Because yes, the melody of your verses should generally be about the same. And yes, the chord progression usually is going to be the same, but that doesn't mean that the way that we actually articulate that chord progression and the way that we actually play each verse needs to be the same. We can use different instruments. We can use different parts that outline the same chords. Another thing we can do to keep our verses more interesting, and this really applies to any music, but is to change things up every 4 bars or so. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to add an instrument. In fact, sometimes you can take an instrument away, or you can change up the part that the instrument is playing. For example, if the first part of your verse has piano block chords, maybe the second part of your verse, or just in another 4 measures, you might want to change it into a arpeggiated part instead, because now you're changing the type of part that the piano is playing. So you don't actually need to take instruments away or add instruments every 4 bars per se, although that is an option. Something else you can do is simply change how the different parts are playing, or you could even swap what part is primary versus another. For example, you could have the piano the primary for the first half of your first verse, the first 4 bars, but then the second 4 bars, you can sort of have the acoustic guitar come in and take over, and the piano actually plays a part that's more of a background part or just fades more into the background. So making sure there's just something that changes every 4 measures is a great way to go to keep your verses more interesting. Another thing we can do to change up our verses a little bit to keep them more interesting is to go off script a little bit melodically. So the underlying melody should still be about the same from verse to verse, but if we want to take it to a higher part, maybe go up a third, adjust the melody just a little bit, go off script with the melody so that it feels a little less like a written melody and a little bit more like a felt melody, a melody with some improvisational techniques thrown in. That is a great way to go, especially if you have longer verses and you really can't do too much with instrumentation changes without it starting to feel just overdone. A great thing to do is to just let the vocal itself sort of carry the changes. And you don't even need to change the melody necessarily. You can also change your vocal stylistics. So for example, in the beginning part of your verse, you may opt for a lighter tone with your voice, but then go a little darker and a little deeper with your tone in the second part of the verse to really add a little bit of gravitas or gravity to it. And of course, you can make other stylistic choices like that. Just think about how you can sort of change up the vocal subtly to really create more intrigue throughout your verses. A 4th way to keep your verses more interesting, and this may seem obvious, but I think it needs to be said, is just to make sure they're not too long. Don't have verses that go on for like a minute and a half, or even a minute could be pretty long for a verse. You don't want your verses to go on for too long without changing up. At some point, you need a change up into a pre-chorus or into a chorus to really create that intrigue in music. You can't listen to the same basic melody over and over again, the same call and answer, call and answer, call and answer for too long before losing interest in it. At some point, it just isn't going to be interesting anymore. So you need to make sure your verses don't wear out their welcome. Verses are important. Verses are great. But we need to make sure we don't stay on them for longer than we need to. And lastly, I think something that's forgotten is the lyrical side of verses. Yes, it's true, some people don't pay attention to lyrics at all. Other people do listen to lyrics. And even some people who don't think they pay attention to lyrics actually pay attention more than they know or realize. And sometimes the reason that people might lose interest in verses and your verses might fall flat or eventually sort of get boring is because your verses don't have anything interesting to say, because all your lyrics are sort of just cookie cutter stuff that's been said before, and nobody really cares to listen to it because frankly, they've already heard the melody, right? Because especially by verse 2, the melody's already been heard. And they've already heard the basic underlying harmonies, the underlying chord progression, even if the arrangement has changed. So if you're not saying anything of interest, you're not saying anything important at all in your verse, why on earth would anybody listen or care? So we need to make sure that we're not repeating ourselves in verses. Verse 2 shouldn't just say what verse 1 said in a different way. It should move the story forward. It should move the plot forward. It should move the idea of the song forward. And we need to make sure to put extra love into making sure our lyrics are of a high quality. In fact, I do something that I like to call the frame test for my lyrics. And the basic idea is I just look at my lyrics without any of the music as a crutch, no melody, no great singer in order to really elevate the lyrics and make them seem deeper than they are. But I just read the lyrics for what they are and read them as if they're poetry. And I ask myself, is this something that would be worthy of putting in a frame and putting it on the wall? Because if our lyrics aren't something that could just be put on the wall and hold their own as solid to good to great poetry, then what even is the point? And even if you don't agree with me that they need to be that good, either way, if we can level up our lyrics and make it a bonus that our lyrics in our songs are actually something worthy of note, something worth paying attention to, then why on earth not? So if you're interested in leveling up your lyrics, something to check out is my 6-step lyric writing checklist. This is what I use in order to make sure that my lyrics are of a certain quality and break it down into steps so that I can do it over and over again rather than relying on luck or relying on the muse or inspiration. Instead, I've broken them down into sort of baby steps so that it's a repeatable process that I can consistently write lyrics that, at least for me, pass my frame test so that I can write lyrics over and over again that I can be proud of, that I can feel like, okay, this is a solid lyric that is worth reading, that is worth listening to, and it's not just relying on the music as a crutch. It passes the frame test. If you're interested in that, be sure to check it out. Free, link in the description down below, because it is setting ourselves up for failure if we just stare at a blank page and basically expect ourselves to improvise lyrics, to improvise poetry. That's skipping so many steps. And then a lot of times people don't spend enough time in the editing side of the process, where they sort of go through even each word to make sure the word is exactly what it should be. Your friend is thesaurus.com, because sometimes the word love doesn't quite do it. It's not quite evocative enough. But if you go to thesaurus.com and find out, oh, adore is actually a better word for what I'm trying to say here than love. It actually is a little more clear, a little less generic of a word, because love applies to brownies and dogs and my wife, but adore doesn't apply to all those things, right? I don't adore Star Wars. I don't adore the Broncos. Well, I might adore the Broncos, but I certainly adore my wife, even if I don't adore brownies or Star Wars. I love those things, but I don't adore them, right? So getting more precise about what words we use via, say, thesaurus.com in the editing process is an example of something that I break down in that 6-step lyric writing checklist. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in leveling up your lyrics. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll talk to you in the next one.